Everyone. My name is Mara Bernstein. I'm the Director of Synagogue Programming and Adult Education here at Park Avenue Synagogue. It's always a pleasure to come together for learning and discussion, and now more than ever, it's so meaningful to be together with you all in community, whether here in our sanctuary or as part of our virtual community, joining via live stream. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Reading Jewish Lives book club program and to share a little bit about Jewish Lives. Jewish Lives, a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation, is a prize-winning series of biographies designed to explore many facets of Jewish identity. Subjects are thoughtfully paired with authors to create lively, deeply informed books. 64 biographies have been published to date, including Golda Meir, Elie Wiesel, Mel Brooks, Amos Oz, Barbara Streisand, and many more. You can learn about their prize-winning books at jewishlives.org. Tonight's topic is on the life and legacy of the feminist, author, and activist Betty Friedan. Our guest tonight is acclaimed writer Rachel Shteir, author of the new Jewish Lives biography, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. Our program will be a dialogue between Rachel and Rabbi Lori Kaufman, and it will be recorded and available for rewatching for anyone who can't tune in tonight or who wants to watch it again. The book is available at a special discount of 25% off at jewishlives.org using the code Friedan at checkout. This is a limited time offer, only available at jewishlives.org. And for those here in person, there are flyers with the QR code that you can take with you to buy the book with the discount. Finally, a special thank you to our partners at Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning and Jewish Lives. We are grateful for your support and longtime partnership. The themes we'll be discussing tonight and the fight for women's rights continues to resonate across the generations. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to one of the teens in our community, Hannah Raskin, to introduce our guest and moderator. Thank you, Hannah.
Hi. Our guest this evening, Rachel Shteir, is an award-winning essayist, writer, and critic. In addition to her biography of Betty Friedan, she's the author of Striptease, The Untold History of the Girly Show, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. Rachel's work has appeared in publications including The New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times Magazine, and more. Rachel is head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program at the Theater School at DePaul University, as she lives in Chicago. Our moderator this evening is Rabbi Lori Kaufman, Director of Content and Innovation at Park Avenue Synagogue. Rabbi Kaufman received an MA in Midrash and her rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you both for being with us tonight. Rabbi Kaufman, I now hand it off to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Mara. Thank you, everyone who's joined us here in person. Thank you, all of us who are joining us online for this really important conversation, given what's happening in the world, both globally, but also in terms of women's issues and feminism. And most importantly, thank you, Rachel, for coming in and speaking to our community.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Jewish Lives, of course, for publishing the book.
Absolutely, and for our partnership. So why did you choose to write about Betty Friedan? And there's lots of books written about her, and including her autobiography. So why her as your topic, and why now?
Well, I first became interested in Betty Friedan about 10 years ago when it was the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique. And at that time, I wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education Review, comparing the Feminine Mystique with some other books that were coming out at the time that were feminist books. And first of all, at that time, I had never read the Feminine Mystique. When I did start to read it, I was shocked at how amazing it was. It was really fantastic. It's very moving, it's very energizing, it's very passionately written. It's a lot of different things. And then secondly, the other books that I was writing about, which were by much younger women, third and fourth wave feminists, those women did not credit Betty at all. I'm just going to call her Betty because I spent 6 years with her, so I feel like I've earned that right. Yeah, they didn't credit her, and although they borrowed from her arguments, and so I became very interested in this. Why were people not talking about Betty? Why were they not giving credit to her ideas? And that was the beginning of my interest.
Great. So why don't what I'd like to do is sort of start back, sort of big picture, and maybe provide like an arc of her life, and then we'll do deeper dives into the specifics. So do you want to sort of do like a life arc?
A biography?
A biography of her and like what she did in her lifetime.
Okay, from the beginning.
From the beginning.
From her birth.
From her birth to her death, and then we'll do a deep dive into just to locate everything.
Okay. So Betty was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois, which is a small town in the middle of Illinois. Her family was Reform. They were at the time when she was growing up in the 1930s. She and her family were the victims of antisemitism in Peoria, and she would write about that much later. She graduated from high school in 1938, and then she went to Smith College, where she was a brilliant student. She won every single award. Some people talk about her as being the best student that Smith ever had, and so on. She was the editor of the school newspaper, and she also became very interested in politics, although her major was in psychology. And so when she graduated from Smith, she first, I think it was 42, she first went to Berkeley for 1 year of grad school in psychology, where she studied with major thinkers like Erik Erikson and other people like that. But she quickly in 1 year dropped out of that program, and she moved to New York and became a journalist for left-wing papers. And then she got married, and she had 3 children, and she moved to the suburbs, to Rockland County, really. She did freelance work for women's magazines. She stopped working for left-wing papers, and it was when she was beginning, she was a mother of these small children living in Rockland County in this gigantic Victorian house that she furnished with auction finds, and she repainted the dining room purple and other things. You know, she loved decorating. But it was at that time that she began to get this idea for a book about women and a book about what it meant to be a housewife. And so this was the mid-50s, so she started to work on this book. It was really a magazine article in the beginning, but no one wanted to publish it. But she kept going. She was extraordinarily tenacious, and she just kept going. She kept going, and she kept trying to get it published. And then finally, she did get an article published. And out of that article, the article was really about are women wasting their education? In other words, women who had gone to school, like herself, in the 1930s, women that she had gone to school with at Smith, many of them had just had given up their careers, and they had families, right? She discovered this at her 15-year Smith reunion. And so, there's a sort of constellation of things that I'm describing. Out of that came the book that became The Feminine Mystique. And that was published in 1963. It was a huge bestseller. It made her a celebrity. She moved back to the city, into the Dakota building on the other side of the park. And then after that, she started another book, but she also became very impatient. She didn't feel that women were making enough progress towards equality. And so she abandoned her second book, and she instead began to work towards co-founding the National Organization for Women, which was founded in 1966. And she was president for the first 4 years until 1970. And then after that, she founded or co-founded a number of other organizations. She had an incredible amount of energy. She was constantly founding or co-founding things like the National Women's Political Caucus. She co-founded a women's bank. She was involved in all sorts of organizations, but she also drifted away from the mainstream women's movement, and you know, some would say even turned against it. And she wrote several other books. One was on aging, and she lived until 2006. I'm sure I've left some important
That's okay.
things
No,
out.
but so we're gonna go deeply. We're gonna talk about the Feminine Mystique.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about the founding of Now. We're gonna talk about like all the complications.
Okay.
So we're gonna go deeply into them. I think it's helpful for people to have the arc of the arc of her life.
Yeah.
But I do want to start actually, even before we get into like all of those accomplishments, to talk a little bit about the role Judaism played in her life. It's going to be a two-part question.
Okay.
Sort of, I'll call it her Jewish journey, because where she started Jewishly and where she ended Jewishly were different.
Yeah.
And also the role of Israel, which is related but also separate. So if you want to address both of those.
Sure. Well, so first to take on the question about her Jewishness. As I said, she grew up in Peoria, this Midwestern town where she felt like the outsider. She was the outsider, and her family felt like the outsider. They were not allowed to join the country club, for example. They had to join the Jewish country club, that sort of thing. Those things really scarred her, but she did not talk about them for many years. Excuse me. She didn't really start talking about her Jewishness until she was in her 50s. And this would be the 1970s. I mean, so I think until that moment, really from the time she was growing up until the 1970s, she identified as culturally Jewish, or maybe even spiritually Jewish, but I don't know if it went beyond that. And then once she began to articulate her Jewishness and to think about her past, she was able to put together the fact that she had felt like an outsider as a child, and the struggle for equality for women, right? She felt that that was really what gave her the strength, that feeling of being an outsider gave her the strength to fight for women. I'm trying to think if I have left anything out. I mean, I just would say, as she grew older, then moving past the 1970s into the 80s, 90s, and aughts, she became more Jewish. She did work in the 80s with several organized Jewish groups, including the American Jewish Congress. And those, like everything in her life, I like to say that Betty was kind of pugilistic in her personal and professional relationships. And so those relationships with organized Judaism also were a little bit pugilistic. I mean, she felt that everyone was not moving fast enough for equality for women, including rabbis and the American Jewish Congress. So that's that.
But I think that there was a time, based on your book, Rachel, that I mean, she did though engage with Blue Greenberg, and she developed a very strong relationship with, and Rabbi Laura Geller. So there were female Jewish role leaders in her life that actually had a pretty healthy influence on her.
Yes, you're right to point that out. And in the 80s, I think especially, she sought out those people as those women when she felt like mainstream feminism was not appreciating her. She, I guess her middle of the road or her centrist ideas about feminism. She felt that Blue Greenberg was able to understand that it was important for women to have a family and be feminist. That was always Betty's. One of the things that Betty did not like about what she felt happened to the feminist movement. She felt that it became too radical and that it didn't appreciate the family enough. And so, yeah, absolutely. And Laura Geller, also, Laura Geller was Betty's son's classmate at Dalton, and Betty supported her in her quest to become a rabbi, and they also were friends. Yeah.
And then Israel.
Israel.
Right.
Okay, and then Israel. So Betty went to Israel 3 times. She was very interested in the kibbutz, And she was very interested in how the kibbutz dealt with childcare, particularly, and how kibbutzniks were able to manage children without having, I don't know, to resort to, I think, what Betty felt were old-fashioned ideas about parenting or conventional American ideas about parenting. She first went in 1972 or 1973, I think, to visit Israel. And at the time, on that visit, the Feminine Mystique had not yet been translated into Hebrew. And as a result, there was not the kind of appreciation for Betty that she liked to, engender in people. And so she became very angry during that trip. But then she went back 2 more times. Once was in 1982. She went to a conference in Haifa, which was a kind of futurist conference with a lot of big celebrities there. And then probably the most important time was in 1984, when it was the summer of 1984, when she helped Israeli women start the first independent Israeli women's feminist group. Betty, one of her great gifts was that she was a great galvanizer. She really knew what to say to people, to incite them, to instigate them. And so she incited Israeli women to get together, Israeli women of all different kinds, to get together and to start this independent meaning outside of any political party, particularly just women coming together. That was very important to her. Betty wanted, and this is another difference between Betty and many of the other feminists of her time, she wanted women of all kinds, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, housewives, all to be together. And not every feminist from her era did.
So I just want to add that she worked with Alice Shalvi in Israel, who was really the mother of the Israeli feminist movement, a wonderful, amazing feminist who just passed away a month ago. And so that was a very significant relationship. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I just want to mention as a female rabbi is that, so it's just like, so she worked with Laura Geller, who was like one of the earliest female rabbis actually ordained.
Yeah, I think the third. I think she was the third.
Right, the third female rabbi. She was a Reform rabbi. She was the third female rabbi ordained, and they had a good relationship. And then also, just want to name the other 2 rabbis who officiated her funeral, who are rabbis here in New York. Rabbi Joy Levitt, who many of us know, officiated her funeral, and Rabbi Jan Urbach also officiated her funeral and at the burial. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to lift up because when Betty started, there were no female rabbis at all, and I think that a lot of her influenced the ability for these women to become rabbis. Actually.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So so her influence, her Jewish influence, was felt like in many ways. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So now let's go a little bit backwards in time. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the feminine mystique. And so, do you want to summarize the argument that she made in the Feminine Mystique? Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. So the Feminine Mystique is, I can say easily what it's not. It's not really a book that is advocating for political action. It's a book diagnosing a condition in America, and the condition is that women are suffering at home, and what they need to do is they need to have something outside of their home, outside of their families that they're passionate about, whether that thing is a creative activity or a job or whatever. Betty doesn't really specify too much. And she goes through many different realms of society, like Freud and psychoanalysis, and she goes through Madison Avenue, and she goes through higher education, and she goes through Kinsey and sexuality, and she analyzes, she critiques each of these areas, and she shows how all of the areas, all of the realms are confining women, and they're all working to oppress women. And it's very persuasive. It's very, and some of the chapters are, I think, relevant today. And so at the end of it, what she talks about, as I said, is women having to have an identity outside of their families and outside of their husbands. And maybe today that doesn't seem revolutionary, but the book, what you have to remember is the book was written in the 50s, okay, and it came out in 1963, and it was revolutionary. And when people came up to her, when it was published, when she was becoming this iconic figure, and then afterwards, for the rest of her life, they would say, "You changed my life." And because women had been thinking, that they were just suffocating by being constrained into this one identity. And then once the book came out, women realized that that was not the case, that many people were also feeling the same thing. So Betty was not the first to make a lot of these points, but she was the first person to popularize. She was a great popularizer, and she was a great, very inspired speaker and communicator of her ideas.
So she talks about also like the drudgery of housework, right? And she talks about like this concept of this, either like the drudgery of housework, or even if you're working like the second shift, and like the role of women in housework.
Yeah, right. The idea that doing housework, Madison Avenue had all of these ads about how sexy vacuum cleaners were, right? How great oven cleaners were, and all of this was a big conspiracy, right, to keep women in their houses and to prevent them from doing whatever it was they were meant to do. I mean, Betty was very much about realizing your potential to the fullest. She wanted that for everybody. That's one of the things that she meant by equality.
Right, and it was like 400 pages. I mean, it was a
huge.
A huge book.
More than that. More than 480, maybe also 500. I think
Right, right. So it was huge. But you also talk about in the book that you said that one of the reasons it was so popular, and we're going to go into some of the criticism of it in a minute. But one of the reasons it was so popular was because of how she wrote it. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, it is a book that's about. It's a social critique, right? It's a lot of it is a critique of social science, but it's also very personal. And she talks about herself, and she talks about how she herself was part of the feminine mystique, and she tells personal stories about being in the magazine world in the 1950s and being in these meetings with editors, and editors saying things like, well, we can't run that story because our housewife readers don't want to read about Martin Luther King Jr. They just want to read about dish soap or something like that. And she would say, oh, well, then I'll pitch them an article about dish soap. So she talks about how she, as a writer, was complicit. But then I think what you're also asking about is also the book at times. One thing I write about is that the book, it has the sense of a thriller. It's written a little bit like a thriller in that, Betty is on the search. She's on a search for whose fault is this, right? Who is the villain here? She doesn't really tell you exactly who the villain is, and that's one of the criticisms of the feminine mystique, actually, and her iteration of feminism in general, is that who is the villain is not exactly clear. It's like something like the system or society or some abstraction, which it's very difficult to despise an abstraction, right? You can't get all agitated about that, yeah.
She also makes a sort of shocking claim, comparing, and this is a quote, "the misery of the frustrated housewife to the unspeakable suffering of the Holocaust victim."
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's chapter 10. I mean, Betty that's one of the more controversial points in the book. That's where Betty compares housewives to concentration camp victims. So I know as I'm saying that, I'm sure the whole audience and world is appalled that I'm saying that, and it is appalling. But what I want to say about it is that in general, in the book, this is another thing about the feminine mystique, the language in it is very heightened. And that's an example of how it's heightened. And I'm not saying that to excuse it, but I think one reason that it's heightened is that Betty, I think now some of these points seem obvious, but in 1963, when Betty was making these points, they were not obvious. It was not obvious that women should be equal, is what I mean. And so I think she felt, to a certain extent, she felt like she had to exaggerate or even sensationalize some of her language, right, in order to get people's attention, right, to be in the public sphere. I mean, no one wanted, before the book came out, no one wanted to hear or read a book about women being equal. And so that whole chapter is about, how women's lives were imprisoning and so on. And later she retracted it, certainly. She retracted that language. That's one of the things I think she didn't like about the feminine mystique as she grew older. Mm-hmm.
Well, we as we age, we change our opinions sometimes, right?
And she did, yeah.
Right.
And she did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there is several critiques of the feminine mystique.
Yes.
So one of them is that she didn't, as you said, she didn't say anything new. Simone de Beauvoir had said the same thing in The Second Sex. Do you want to talk a little bit about that critique?
Yeah, I mean, so, right, there are many critiques that were made of the feminine mystique beginning from when it first came out. So it was, as I said, very popular, but it was also controversial. So one critique was Betty just borrowed Simone de Beauvoir's argument. The Second Sex had come out 10 years earlier in 1953. And I mean, I personally don't think that this argument is, I mean, I think it's true on the one hand. Yes, Betty did borrow some of Simone de Beauvoir's arguments, but Simone de Beauvoir was French. She was living with Jean-Paul Sartre. You know, she was a French intellectual who was also having an affair with the Chicago writer Nelson Algren. Betty was had 3 children and had grown up in Peoria, Illinois. And the two women had completely opposite profiles and writing styles. And Simone de Beauvoir's book never became the kind of mass phenomenon that Betty's book did, and couldn't have, because an American readership just could not tolerate the French intellectual philosophical slant. I mean, Betty was much more the pragmatist. Simone de Beauvoir was really a separatist. She was really like down with the patriarchy. Betty was not down with the patriarchy, right? She loved men and she wanted men to be part of now. She always thought that was one of the big problems. That was one of the big reasons why the women's movement, in her opinion, did not get as far as it got, was that too many of the women in the women's movement did not want men to be part of it.
Great. And another critique is that it only focused on white suburban housewives.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was a critique almost from the beginning. I mean, I think there's a letter from gosh, what is her name? A scholar early on, a well-known scholar, saying, Betty, there's no working class women in your book, and there's no black women in your book, and that's true. Well, it's true. It's not true that there are no black women in the book, but Betty, I mean, what I'd say about that is Betty's concern was not racial politics, certainly not in the sense that we think about it now. Her concern was women as a category. And what she's trying to do in The Feminine Mystique is she's trying to set out women as a category, and she's trying to just talk about that. I don't think, and that's one answer, I think, to that critique. I think another answer is that in the archives of her papers, which are held at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, there is some evidence that she did try in certain places to talk about race more than is reflected in the published Feminine Mystique. But those sections were cut. As Lori pointed out, the book is hugely long already, and I've never seen this correspondence between her and her editors, but I'm sure they said, the book is too long and you have to cut it, and you're talking about women, and then what else are you talking about? So, yes, that is a critique that was made, and it was particularly harsh. It became particularly harsh in the 80s, like bell hooks particularly takes Betty down. But to me, those critiques kind of miss the point of what the Feminine Mystique is about. Yeah.
Great. Anything else you want to say about the Feminine Mystique that we haven't covered?
I think it's a great book and everybody should read it. I also think it's really long. I mean, it's not perfect, right? Especially in art, and it's repetitive. But you can page through the pages. I think it's really. I think some of the sections of it are beautiful and beautifully written, particularly the ending. It's almost utopian. It talks about, how there will be equality and, what that will mean for both men and women. It's kind of moving.
And it's just interesting to hear you say you read it and you still feel it's relevant, and it's still selling a lot. Right.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I regularly now people hear from people because of the book who email me and say, I'm reading the Feminine Mystique and I really love it, or something like that. Like, okay, great.
It's both wonderful and sad that it's still relevant, right?
I think Betty's, I guess what I think is Betty's project of trying to make a space for women is still ongoing, right? I think that's the sad part of what you're saying, yeah.
Right. So let's now turn a little bit to the founding of NOW.
Yes.
Why don't you give a little bit of history?
Yes.
Because it had like a contentious birth, I would say, also.
Yes, well, so I think, as I said, I think to me the main thing is that Betty felt that things were not moving quickly, things were not changing quickly enough for women in 1964 and 1965, right after she wrote the Feminine Mystique, and there were a bunch of women in Washington who were trying to organize some kind of women's movement, and they wanted Betty to be their leader. And at first, Betty said no, she refused. And the main reason she refused is she knew herself, and she knew that she was not really temperamentally suited to becoming the leader of a major, organization, civic organization, advocacy organization. But the women persisted, and eventually she gave in. And I think what you're referring to is the famous meeting in the hotel room in Washington in 1966. It was at this conference where there were arguments about exactly what kind of women's movement this would be. And one thing that people often talk about when they talk about Betty is her temper. And that's why she initially didn't want to become president of NOW. And so in this argument, as NOW was being founded, she yelled at another woman, and she ran into the bathroom and slammed the door and said, "This is my hotel room and my liquor. Get out." Okay, but eventually she came out, and the next day they all went downstairs and they founded NOW. So, yeah.
And she ran it for
4 years.
Right.
She ran it from 1966 to 1970, and during that time, an enormous amount of things were accomplished. I'd say one of the major things is the Women's Strike for Equality, which actually technically was right after Betty stepped down as president. In typical Betty fashion, she stepped down as president. I think it was in March or in February or something like that. And then she went to the conference, the NOW conference, where she was supposed to give a speech announcing the next president and talking about how, what was the future of NOW going to be. Okay, and she did do that, but it was a 2 or 3 hour speech. Okay, and during that 2 or 3 hour speech, she talked about how in 5 months there was going to be this national action, which was the Women's Strike for Equality. Maybe some people in the room or watching us even were at this event. It was August 26, 1970. And it was an amazing event in New York. It was, all over the country, but the one in New York was enormous. I think there were between 10 and 20,000 people. It was women marching all the way down Fifth Avenue. It was a really phenomenal event. And that's really what moved Now from becoming a small grassroots organization into something more substantial. And that was Betty's idea. As I said, though, at the beginning of my whatever remarks about this, it also was, it was a little bit, as she was leaving, she handed it over to her colleagues and said, "You do this."
Right.
Okay.
She announced it and said it's going to be in 3 months, and now I'm leaving, and you take over to you. Right.
So she was very mischievous in that way. Mm-hmm.
Right. But she sort of, I would say, got pushed out. I mean, and so do you want to talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, I know.
And a little bit also about her personality and what you've talked a little bit about it, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that, so in this 4 years between 1968 and 1970, an enormous amount of things happened in the women's movement, legislatively, but also culturally. And one of the main things was the founding of Women's Lib in 1968. And Women's Lib was comprised of younger women, and they were even more impatient with Betty and with Betty also, and they felt that things were moving too slowly, things were moderate, and also they were more in the Simone de Beauvoir mode, right, in that they were very down with the patriarchy, we're going to be separatist, and also either we're going to be separatists, meaning no men, or we're lesbians and we want to assert that. We want that to be part of the platform. And Betty was not for this. She was not for any of it. I'd say that's probably the major reason why she got pushed out of the movement, or she is not, she is erased, as I discovered 10 years ago, is because she really felt in general that sexual politics should not be the major or even a major platform of the movement. She felt that anything sexual would distract from the major, what she felt should be now's major issues, which were equality of pay, equal representation in politics, reproductive rights, so there were really those core issues to her, which I think she considered bread and butter, where she worried that this focus on sexual politics would just overshadow those. And, but the people, the younger women were very impatient, and so sort of pushed her to the side, and that's that's sort of what for the next 10 years at least that's what was going on with her and the movement.
And you said there's a language you used. She wanted to make Now as unthreatening as possible. So she wanted it to be look like Housewives, to have it look mainstream, right?
Yeah. She worried that it would become that the women's movement would become niche. That that it would become it was going to be radical, and then and if it was radical, she worried that it would be dismissed. So she was always trying to bring in housewives, and one of her friends was a beauty queen from Michigan, for example. She tried to bring her in, and her whole point was that anyone can be a feminist, right? There's not any particular profile of a feminist.
Right, and one of the things that happened with the sexual politics was her language, the lavender menace. So,
yes.
So she got dubbed being anti-gay, right, anti-lesbian. So do you want to explain what happened?
Yeah, this is during the same period when in 1969 a group of lesbian women were trying to argue that they should be able to come out of the closet, and that Now should take up lesbian rights as part of its platform. And Betty used the phrase lavender menace, okay, to kind of cut I'm sort of laughing, I'm sorry, but lavender menace is kind of funny at this point, to cut them down. That part's not funny. And you know, again, I mean, I'm not defending the way she did it, right? I'm not defending her style, but I think it came from a place of a real anxiety that sexual politics would fragment the women's movement, that it would shatter the women's movement.
And she also got sort of criticized also for, again, not like women of color, right? So not being as inclusive.
Yeah, no, same thing. I mean, she also, when I think, again, in the late 60s, when Black power feminism was on the rise, right? Again, Betty felt that this was going to overshadow what she considered these bread and butter concerns, and she also, she worried that, again, she had worked really hard to try and bring men into the women's movement, and she worried that if women saw men as the enemy, and if that was considered to be one of the major platforms of feminism, then feminism would be dismissed.
And sort of most famously, she and Gloria Steinem, like, so when you think about, they didn't have the most amicable relationship, let's say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is all part of this, this is all part of the same scene. Gloria was 12 years younger than Betty. Gloria was very beautiful also, and very elegant and poised, and the media made her its darling. And I think Betty felt very resentful of that. I think that's part of the equation. But I think they also had genuine ideological differences. Gloria, for example, was not necessarily for the kind of wide political spectrum that Betty wanted to include in feminism. She was more, had more progressive ideas about who feminists could be or were. But unfortunately, one of the shocking to me things about writing this book was the research and seeing how these issues were covered in the media of the time. And they were almost like, for example, this argument or whatever ideological debate or disagreement between Gloria and Betty was kind of covered as a catfight. And to me, that's a way of dismissing what are really real concerns about real differences of opinion that women have. But at the same time, Betty also was not, she was not quiet about her dislike, and I would not say she behaved well, whereas I think Gloria did behave very well and with dignity. But Betty would often talk about Gloria to the media, and that did not help matters. So it's a complex issue.
Right,
yeah.
and you talk about how Gloria was the media darling. Betty was definitely not a media darling. She suffered badly in the public image. Do you want to talk about that?
I think just that, from the beginning, as I said, so although the book did very well, it was a bestseller, and Betty became a celebrity, also, from the beginning, it was very controversial, not just for the reasons, legitimate kind of questions of who is in this book and so on, but also just because Betty was super forceful. She was completely take no prisoners, kind of unapologetic, and TV was just on the rise, so she would be on these talk shows. And the way that often male TV talk show hosts would cut her down or just try and shut her up is just appalling, right? And so you can see that she had to develop this enormously thick skin, and she had to develop this kind of strategy for living in the public, in the public eye, that I think is, to our, looking back at it, it seems enormously abrasive, but to me it also seems self-protective.
And they also, they actually went after her looks and her clothes.
They did.
And
it got very personal, yes. I mean, she was, the media often talked in very derogatory ways about her looks. They would often describe, whatever she was wearing as being, and suggesting that it was like inappropriate for a woman to be wearing this or that. that was in general the case for feminism, anytime feminism was covered. And just the way it's sort of, I guess the way I think of it is the media tried to ridicule her, you know.
So what did you learn in your research that surprised you? You know, you'd sort of like came to this, and then when you were doing your research, was there anything that you were found that was sort of shocking or surprising?
I mean, so many things, many of which I've been talking about, but I mean, I think one of the ones we've been talking about is just when I started the book, and I was interviewing people initially, one of the things was that many people had these anecdotes about Betty, and they were from 60 years ago, and they were all very critical of her, right? And I thought, wow, you know, I'm gonna write about this person. How is that gonna be? You know, how am I going to handle that? You know, then what struck me after a little while was that there were very few of the people really had thought about, like, why did she act this way, right? And so I sort of tried to put that together. I think it startled me at first, you know, how many stories there were of her, you know, I guess outlandish or volatile.
Do you want to share one
volatile?
or two?
Yeah, sure. I'll share one. I mean, I think a famous one is, well, with her brother. She was at, her older brother, younger brother, Harry. She was at his place in California one time for dinner. And some people asked her, Betty, you know, could you tell us what is the feminist movement or something like that? And she just lashed out at them. She just, you know, laid into them. And then later, walking to the car with Harry, Harry said, Betty, why did you do that? Why did you lash out at those people? I've been to dinner at your place 1,000,000 times, and I've never lashed out at anybody at your house. And she said, Harry, I don't invite idiots to my house. Okay. You know, I mean, so that's kind of, you know, on the one hand, yes, that's outrageous, and, you know, I feel sorry for the people who she lashed out at. But on the other hand, I tried to put myself in her place and think, like, why did she do that? You know, why did she do that? And what I came up with was, I think that she did it because I think in the 80s, I think, first of all, she became very concerned about her legacy, particularly with the critiques of the feminine mystique. And I think she wanted people to remember her for more than just the feminine mystique and not just the criticisms of the feminine mystique. And I think also, I think by that time she felt, well, people should know what feminism is. Like, why should I have to be the one to constantly tell people what is feminism? You know, I think she was, you know, she was sort of angry about that. And then this was also about the time when the ERA failed, the Equal Rights Amendment. Maybe some of you remember that. And I think she was devastated by that. And, you know, and just worried, would there even be?
Because that was one of her successes at Now, right? Was working on the ERA.
Was working on it, and many states ratified it, but then the tide shifted, and it never became a constitutional amendment. Yeah.
Right. So what do you think her legacy is? I mean, it feels like you tried, in some ways, you talk about writing this book to sort of redeem her, right?
Yeah.
Because she suffers from so much erasure, as you talk about, and criticism.
Yeah.
What do you think her legacy should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think her legacy is that she was the first person to really talk about women in the public space, just as a group, as a category, and she tried to really, you know, she tried to really put that out there, that there should be just a place where we can talk about women, and hopefully there still is.
So I want to open it up for questions in case anyone has questions. Mara's got a microphone. Anyone have any questions? I've got a couple more for Rachel, but great.
So in the 17 or so years since her death, What do you think Betty would say about areas in which women have made progress and the areas in which we continue to face pretty significant challenges?
Yeah, well, at the end of her life, as I said, she was very concerned about her legacy and about the fact that she felt that there was so far still to go. And I think, obviously, I mean, she would look at Me Too. I don't know if she would see that as a success, honestly, because, again, as I said, I think she considered anything that had to do with sexual politics to be a distraction from the real issues. So I have to think then that she would probably be extremely upset with where women are right now, and feel that there have been a number of setbacks that need addressing.
What would she think about what's happened with Roe?
Oh, she would think it's appalling. She would think it's terrible.
You talk about actually early on in her life, she actually helped women get abortions. Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, she was a very early supporter of abortion rights, right, even in the 40s when she was a young person. She helped her friends, and then in the 60s, in 1968, she fought really hard to get abortion, on the platform of the National Organization for Women, but she concluded that abortion needed its own organization, right? That it was such an enormous issue, and she went on to co-found. This is another instance of her co-founding another organization, NARAL, which I think still exists today, which is devoted to reproductive rights. But even when I think of that, it's pretty amazing that she did that. She had the initiative to go found this other organization, yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I mean, because she was someone who kept reinventing herself,
Yeah.
right? She did like the feminine. She was a writer. I mean, she started off as a political writer, right?
Yeah.
And she was a writer.
Yeah.
And then
Women's magazines.
and then wrote the Feminine Mystique, and then founded Now, and
Yeah.
then became politically active in
Yeah.
her later life too.
Yeah.
Sometimes for the better and sometimes for worse,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, she was an evolver, and I think
Right.
she would have liked that you said that a lot, because I think she wanted people to remember her for more than just the Feminine Mystique. She wanted people to see that she had evolved through the course of her lifetime, and that, I think, includes her Jewish identity as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Great. Naomi.
I'm curious about her marriage and her role as a mom and how that all has played out over time.
Very complex question.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I think first her children, I think her children were enormously important to her. I mean, I know they were in the formation of the Feminine Mystique and writing it, and the way she saw, just the way she saw motherhood. I mean, she was not what I would call a conventional mother, though. I mean, she was a writer during the years that her children were young, and she's written about this, that like her daughter would knock at the door of her writing room, "Mommy, let me in," and she would not answer the door, that kind of thing. And she would send the kids to school in a taxi. This was when they lived in Rockland County, or there are lots and lots of stories like that, and I do tell some of those stories in the book. But then there's other stories too, where like her husband Carl and she were really devoted parents, and they did these extraordinary things with their children, like stay up all night to watch the Sputnik launch, or they were really invested in their children achieving. They were really invested in their children's humanism and individuality in, I think, moving ways. So that played a role in the Feminine Mystique. I think her thinking about that, and she also, when she was in Rockland County, she was, she was, as you're saying, she was busy. So she also founded this educational organization for like overachieving young children, children and teenagers, and that was because of her children were those things, and she felt that they weren't being challenged adequately in schools. So she founded this other organization where they could go and meet, famous scientists and architects and so on. Anyway, but okay, now on to her marriage. That's equally complex. She did not have a happy marriage. Maybe some people in the room know this. She had a very tumultuous, violent marriage, and it was a source of great shame for her. And she did not really talk about it openly. I'm trying to think, when was the first time? I think it was, it may have been in her memoir, but it was known by many people. And she really worried that if it came out that she was in this violent marriage, that it would discredit the women's movement. And so she tried to keep it a secret. And then she divorced in 1970, the year of the women's strike for equality. And she had several affairs, some long-term ones, but she never married again. And I think she wanted to get married. That was a great source of sadness for her. But I think, I think this thing about the violence in her marriage is tragic, really. I think it's tragic. I think that I think it shaped her thinking about women being trapped, particularly. And I think if she had been born later, I'm not sure that things would have played out in exactly the same way.
And also you talk about how her relationship with her mother influenced her thinking too, like watching, she had a complicated relationship with her mother.
Yes, her mother, so her mother, Miriam, was very beautiful, was very poised and well-dressed and elegant, and Betty was not really any of those things. And so when Betty was growing up, one of the ways that she dealt with that was by reading. I think another way was excelling in school. Another way was acting. She was a child, she acted in high school and a little bit in Smith. But she fought very hard to not be like her mother and to not be, I think she felt that her mother was a conformist, and I think she felt also like her mother's ideas about Judaism were not substantive. The irony, though, is that when Betty's father died, Miriam completely, she took over her husband's business. She, left Peoria and eventually moved to Los Angeles. She got into a lot of different things. And in general, she started to have a completely different kind of life. And I also think that's sad that Betty and she were never really able to reconcile. Not until Miriam was on her deathbed, I would say. Yeah.
Great. So I want to close with a quote from your introduction.
Okay.
Do you want to read?
Oh, sure.
Great. So I just, I think that just to close in your own words.
Which part? This?
Yeah. Just
Friedan was no saint.
Yeah.
This part?
Yeah. Exactly. Because we were just.
Oh, okay.
I think that sort of sums up a lot of what we were talking about.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Friedan was no saint, but she was an oracle and an iconoclast ahead of her time. The American activist with a Russian soul, the artist of moral and intellectual fervor driven by a desire to change herself and others. She imagined herself under the shadows of history and eternity, acting with remorseless courage. She said things about women, about Jews, that many people did not want to hear. As Daniel Friedan, her eldest son, said about her, I think of the words attributed to Archimedes. Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I will move the earth. Betty Friedan moved the earth.
And I just want to add that I think that I'm going to sort of end where we started with the Jewishness of her, right? Because you talk about how her anti-Semitism influenced, the anti-Semitism, her feeling like an outsider, made her realize, as a woman, she's an outsider and that. But I also think that, we're iconoclasts, right? And there's something about, this week's Torah portion is about Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham was literally the first iconoclast. He broke the idols. And Sarah, she's our one of our matriarchs. She also, she didn't sort of necessarily follow the norms, and she was pretty tough. And I think that our tradition encourages people standing up for the other, for the outsider, to look beyond themselves. And so I think that you know, her Judaism influenced a lot of her experience, as she talks about. So I want to thank you.
Oh,
thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
It's great. Thank you for writing the book. I highly recommend it. Thank you all for coming, for joining us. And again, I'm going to wish you a Shabbat Shalom because it's Thursday night. And we look forward to our next Jewish Lives event, which will be in the spring. Actually, I'll give a preview. Our next Jewish Lives event will be in March or April, and we're going to be talking about Elijah with the scholar Daniel Matt, just in time for Passover. So great. So thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Amazing.